Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So good afternoon, everyone. There isn't a very big Scottish connection, so it shouldn't take we know that Janet was born in England, that her mother was English, that her father had both English and Irish background, and yet, throughout her life, Janet described herself as Scottish. And in his book about the Stuart family, her father was at pains to show that the family was descended from the royal Stuart line of Scotland. Just a few days ago, I heard from Margaret Wilson here that this claim has recently been vindicated by the results of a DNA test, which show that the present Earl of Mount Stuart is a direct descendant of Walter, High Steward of Scotland, and ancestor of Robert, who became the King of Scotland in 1370. That's not Robert the Bruce, this is much later than Robert the Bruce. And it's from the third son of this Robert, Duke of Albany, that the Stuarts of Castle Stuart, that's Janet's family, are descended. In 1425, the family fortunes of this branch waned, and the Duke of Albany and his eldest son were executed, and their Scottish titles and lands were confiscated. The older sons fled to Ireland for safety, but the youngest, Walter, remained in Scotland, protected by his mother. And who was his mother? It was the person Sue was talking about last night, Janet Erskine. We know about Janet Erskine because she and her husband had to obtain a dispensation from Pope Martin V to marry, because they were already within the forbidden degrees of kinship, he being a Stuart, she being an Erskine. I don't think it was any accident that Canon Stuart called his daughter Janet Erskine Stuart. She's called after the ancestors who saved the line by protecting the younger son. So, in the reign of James II of Scotland, the exiled Stuarts returned to their native land, and the head of the house became Lord Avondale, and later Lord Ochiltree. But the third Lord Ochiltree alienated his Scottish title and his land, and he went back to Ireland. And so, by the time Janet was born, more than 2 centuries had passed since the Stuarts owned land in Scotland. And yet, Mother Stuart invariably gave Scottish, or Scotch, as was acceptable in those days. Today it's only used for whiskey or dogs. She put down Scotch was her nationality, and she had tremendous love for things Scottish and for the land of Scotland all her life. As a child living in the rectory at Cottesmore, Janet visited Scotland and Ireland and Germany, and Maud Monaghan tells us that she went to Scotland frequently, but she gives us tantalisingly few details about these visits. Janet herself gives us a little insight in her book, Education of Catholic Girls, when she recalls meeting an old Scottish schoolmaster. He would have been called the Dominie, and his teaching methods really impressed her. She writes, "He urged his scholars on by his personal enthusiasm for knowledge. Having no assistant, his own personality was the soul of the school. The boys had the best of it. Lassies were not deemed worthy of the classics, and the classics were everything to him. But although he told her that he considered that lassies were mostly daft, he accepted Janet's help, and he even gave her a class to teach." Maud Monaghan also tells us that on one occasion Janet went out of her way to make an expedition to a place called Anwyth by the Solway. I'd never heard of this Anwyth by the Solway, no wonder, it's only a little country area. But it gave me the desire to go there, as it was the one place I knew that she had spent time. So, with a friend, and it's ecumenical, she's an Episcopalian friend, we went off on this long journey from the northeast to the southwest extreme to see where she had gone. I was hoping to unearth some gems of information. Well, I didn't get any gems of information, but to be where she was, to be looking out on the estuary, to be looking out in the parklands, to be walking in her footsteps to go to the church where she had worshipped, that was enriching enough. It was a great experience. Speaking of this visit of Janet's, Maud Monaghan says, she made this special expedition to Anwoth, near Anwoth by the Solway, for the hymn Emmanuel's Land was already very dear to her, and she insisted on seeing the place that had inspired Samuel Rutherford with love so great that he could write, "E'en from the verge of heaven I drop for thee a tear." The hymn from which these lines come is well known in many churches in Scotland, especially the Free Scottish Presbyterian Church, which is a very strict branch. And it was actually written by a woman called Anne Cousin, who probably was there in Anwoth when Janet visited, the wife of the Free Church minister there. And it's a brilliant summary of Samuel Rutherford's teaching. Now, at that time when I read this, it seemed very surprising that an English lady, a refined English lady, with Anglican background, with leanings towards the Catholic Church, should be so profoundly influenced by this 17th century Presbyterian divine. He wrote a famous book called Lex Rex, and in it he was showing that if you lived by the gospel, you didn't need either bishops or kings. And he was quite happy when Charles I lost his head. Now you might say that's a very surprising kind of person for her to be so influenced by. Other people have mentioned a trait of her character, which is very much in evidence here, that she could look at something which was initially not very attractive and find the true ore, the gold dust. So she did that on this occasion because it was said of Samuel Rutherford, when he spoke of Jesus, he was a man transformed, and he had the power to kindle a similar love in the hearts of all those who heard him preach. And in that hymn, which I hope to play for you at the end, it's a real Victorian hymn, but there's something in it that she was seeing of great value. He says, "The sight of Jesus' face is almost the entire glory of heaven." And in the hymn, she says, "The Lamb is all the glory of Emmanuel's land." Someone else mentioned, I think maybe Sue, mentioned that the Victorians had this desire for heaven, spoke often about going to heaven, and the whole of the hymn is about that. It's about reaching Emmanuel's land, and it's not for the reward we'll get, but to be in the presence of the Lamb who is the light thereof. That's all the information I have of the years before Janet was received into the Catholic Church. And so we have to fast forward now to 1895. And that is when she came to Aberdeen. In 1895, there were Sacred Heart convents and schools in England, 5 in number. And in Ireland, there were 4. And the House Journal of Roehampton relates that it had long been the wish of our mothers in Paris and of our friends that a house should be founded in Scotland. So one day, early in 1895, Mother Stewart received a letter from a Father Bissett, parish priest of Nairn. If you don't know Scotland, Nairn is a little seaside town where a lot of people retire to, just south of Inverness. He was asking earnestly for a foundation by the Sacred Heart Sisters in his parish. Mother Stewart passed the letter to the Mother House in Paris, and a few days later she got a reply, it would have been from Reverend Mother de Sertorius, that she was to write to the Bishop of Aberdeen and consult him on the advisability of making such a foundation. In her correspondence with Bishop Hugh MacDonald, Mother Stewart mentioned that we generally choose larger centres where good can be done to a bigger number of souls. But she then asked the bishop if he could see an opening for our work in the city, and the bishop's answer has come down to us in these words: "What? Go to Nairn and preach to the fishes in the cold North Sea?" Certainly not. You'll come here to Aberdeen and help to warm the hearts of the people of the Granite City by devotion to the heart of Christ. Now, I was telling our own bishop about that. He's another Hugh, Benedictine. And I told him that, and he said, and do you know one of the things he said just before he died? He said, the best thing I ever did as a bishop was to bring the Sacred Heart nuns to Aberdeen. So in April of that year, Reverend Mother Digby, then an Assistant General, and Reverend Mother Stewart, Superior Vicar of England and Ireland, arrived in Aberdeen, and they were warmly welcomed by the Sisters of Nazareth and by the Bishop, who gave them every help in his power while they were searching for a suitable house. Well, the story goes that the cabman who was driving around in a horse and trap stopped outside the big house called Westwood, the house that they subsequently bought, and said that that's the house for them. And he said he heard it was going to be sold privately. When they told the bishop, he agreed, yes, that was the very house, and the two nuns recalled that Reverend Mother de Sartorius had pointed to that very area on the map and said, that's where you're to go. So the matter was put into the hands of Mr. John Craigan, the solicitor who was to be our good friend for many, many years. And in June, Mr. Craigan heard the property, yes, would be put on the market. He didn't know when. When she heard this, Mother Stewart travelled back to Aberdeen. In those days, it was a long, long rail journey. This time she was accompanied by Reverend Mother Thunder, the Superior of Roehampton. And once more, they enjoyed the hospitality of the Sisters of Nazareth, who lived which is a place which is the oldest Catholic church in Aberdeen, St. Peter's. Hearing that the owner of Westwood was away, the two nuns decided they would try to see through the house on their own, if possible, and find out just when it might come on the market. So they got dressed in secular attire. And one wonders, you know, here they are, far, far from home. Aberdeen's full of charity shops today. I can only suppose that they borrowed them from people like Mrs. Craigan, you know. Anyway, dressed in secular dress, they arrived at the door, and the maid opened it for them and admitted that, yes, the rumour of the forthcoming sale was indeed true. But at that moment, while we were talking to the maid, didn't Mrs. Millen herself arrive, the lady of the house, and informed the callers that her house was definitely not for sale. And one wonders if their appearance rather put her off, didn't recommend them as prospective buyers. However, after some conversation on the doorstep, the nuns were invited to look at the rooms, and there's a very beautiful room. The door opens facing the main door, and there's a big, big bay window, as often happened in Victorian houses, onto what would have been a lawn, but is now the school playground. So they thought, well, this is good, we're getting somewhere, but any sort of idea that she was softening was ended when she called after them. And I ask you to inform your solicitor that I want no more such visits from you. So that was it. However, Mr. Craigan was so skillful that he managed to open negotiations and was able to get the contract signed and money paid without Mrs. Milne ever knowing that the purchasers were nuns. She was so angry that she was willing to buy back the house at a higher price. We didn't give it to her. And in all fairness, to finish that story, I should say, a formidable woman, but a good woman. And she did a great deal of good in Aberdeen, and she founded a kind of school for nurses to help the poor. And later on in her life, she said she was indeed very happy that her beautiful home was now a place of education for young ladies. So it ended well. One other episode there was, during that first exploratory visit to Aberdeen, Mother Stewart was greatly attracted by an early devotion in the city centred on an ancient statue, a statue known as Our Lady of Aberdeen. It was carved in wood in the Middle Ages, and the original statue was taken into hiding during the Reformation and then shipped off to the Low Countries for safekeeping. I don't think in England you ever had the kind of iconoclasm that we had, the type of very severe Calvinism where statues were considered to be idolatry. It's the only statue known to have been preserved since pre-Reformation times in Scotland, the only one. So it was taken off. A family called the Gordons of Huntly were the staunch backbone of the Catholic resistance, and it would seem that they were the people who managed to get it smuggled out on a ship, and I've seen it in the Church of Finisterre. I'll just tell you briefly that when we went, Mass was just ending, the chapel was packed with students, and the priest was coming out, and he said, "Are you on holiday?" I said, "Oh, where are you from?" I said, "From Aberdeen." He said, "Oh, but you are not getting her, you are not taking her." No, she belongs here. And he said, "In Aberdeen, would there be all this big crowd of people all the time, all the students coming?" I said, "No, I don't think so." And he said, "No, this is her home now." So that's been her home for a few hundred years. In a letter to Bishop Hugh MacDonald of Aberdeen, Mother Stewart wrote, "Father Chisholm made us spend a delightful afternoon in Old Aberdeen, Woodside and Bridge of Dawn, and he brought us back full of the wish to bring back Our Lady of Aberdeen to our old home." She was full of enthusiasm about this. He had told her the story, and she felt sure that if that devotion was brought back, Mary would bring the faith back to the northeast. She must have passed on her enthusiasm to her superior general, now Mother Digby. And when the foundresses arrived to begin their work in Aberdeen, there was a surprise waiting for them. When the first members arrived, they were preceded by Dearmer, who was the gardener at Roehampton. And he had come in a terrible, terrible storm by ship with all the heavy things, crates and furniture and stuff. And he had slept in the cold, dark house on a crate. So when the sisters arrived in the early part of the day, they opened one of the big crates, and what was in it? The first facsimile statue of Our Lady of Aberdeen to reach Aberdeen. Oh. And when Mother Stewart arrived in the evening, when she came in the door, she was greeted by the statue of Our Lady of Aberdeen. And if you go into that house, Bishop's house, you'll be greeted by her today. She's been there for 100 and something years. So that was Mother Digby's gift to the new foundation. Mother Stewart could never have foreseen how her affection for Our Lady under this title would awaken devotion to Mary in the Aberdeen diocese. And after her example, the religious of the Sacred Heart in Aberdeen fostered the devotion, and in their school, the children took it out to their parishes when they went home. And there were two gifted people in the community, Mother Forbes, you may have heard of her, she's associated with Craig Lockert, who wrote the hymn, Our Lady of Aberdeen, and Mother, I don't know how to pronounce her name really, I have to look at it to see how you wrote it. Micallef, don't know where she came from. McCarrick. Mother McCarrick, who was a very gifted musician. And so the antiphon, or anthem, or what we like to call it, of the Aberdeen diocese has come from the Sacred Heart and come from the enthusiasm of Janet Stewart, who began all that. So Father Healy has written a little book called the Hidden Statue. And in that book he says this: 1895 is a memorable year in the history of devotion to Our Lady of Aberdeen. In April of that year, Father Duncan Chisholm, a devout priest in charge of the old church of St. Peter, met two nuns of the Society of the Sacred Heart, Reverend Mother Digby and Reverend Mother Stewart, Superior at Roehampton. They were paying an exploratory visit to Aberdeen with a view to the establishment of a convent. Father Chisholm's devotion to Our Lady of Aberdeen inspired them. For this, we have the testimony of Reverend Mother Stewart herself. 2 or 3 years later, the Society of the Sacred Heart published a book by Father Chisholm about Our Lady of Aberdeen, and as I say, it was the society that helped to make the devotion known, and it certainly did help to flame the fire of the faith. One last thing I'd like to mention briefly, and for this I have to thank Carmel Byrne, who's with us. Another aspect of the legacy of Mother Stewart to Scotland, much of the work of Religious of the Sacred Heart in Scotland in recent times has been in the field of spirituality. In Edinburgh, Kilgraston and Aberdeen, we're engaged in spiritual direction, in Ignatian exercises, retreats, days of prayer, etc. In undertaking this work, we're following in the footsteps of people like Mother Stewart, and indeed St. Madeleine Sophie herself. In a book entitled Writings on Spiritual Direction by Great Christian Masters, which Carmel told me about, the authors trace a direct line of, you might say, inherited wisdom from the Abbé Ouvenin in Paris, who died in 1910, to the Baron von Hugel, to Father Denol, S.J., to Mother Stewart. And that's within the Catholic tradition you have Father Denol and Mother Stewart, and within the Anglican tradition you have Evelyn Underhill. And this was a big breakthrough because it wasn't usual for women to be spiritual directors. And Evelyn Underhill in the Anglican communion had a hard uphill struggle to be accepted seriously, and of course she was a brilliant retreat giver and spiritual writer. And Mother Stewart, being very diffident, you know, sort of kept very quiet about it, but it was known that she was a superb spiritual director. So you get that line of tradition. So I hope it's not too presumptuous to suggest that those of us in Scotland today who engage with like trepidation in this ministry stand within the great tradition in which Janet Stewart shines like a guiding star. I just wonder which of us wouldn't like to want it said of her as of Mother Stewart. She has the sympathy and the intuition of the saints. Or, her spirit changes weakness to strength. And she seems to be the very channel of God's grace to souls. Isn't that lovely? What a gift to have within our own society such a model to encourage us and guide us. So just to sum up very quickly, the Scottish connection. A Stuart connected to the royal line of Scotland with a great love for Scotland and its people, ecumenical in outlook, recognising holiness wherever it was found, founders of the convent and the school in Aberdeen, intuitive in promoting devotion to Our Lady of Aberdeen, and still a source of wisdom and encouragement for the RSCJ in Scotland who follow in her footsteps in the ministry of spiritual direction. So I finish with one or two little pictures, and if we have time, we could play that hymn, which she loved. It is Victorian, and we don't always respond to that kind of language and music, but she's the kind of person who could get beyond that to the worth underneath, and maybe we can make the same effort. I want to say a word. This is, that's the courtyard of the old church in Aberdeen, where we still go to Mass, which she visited. And there's a plaque on the other side of the door, that blue door, telling you, oh no, you can see the plaques. Yeah. The plaques are saying that the Nazareth House nuns lived there. And Father Chisholm, who so inflamed her love for Our Lady of Aberdeen, he would have said Mass and she would have gone to Mass through that arched door at that side. That's the inside of it, and that's Our Lady of Aberdeen in her niche up there to the left. Yeah, that is Westwood, and today it is the Bishop's house. We go to Mass there at 8 o'clock and greet Mary on our way in and greet her on the way out, the one that was in the packing case when the foundresses arrived. And it's a very beautiful house, very beautiful, but like many Victorian houses, most of the beauty is looking out to the garden. That's Our Lady of Aberdeen. She has a crown, a big crown, and the child has what I'm told is an imperial crown. It's a painted statue, but made of wood. I think the original is about 4 feet high. It's not full size. And in nearly every church of the diocese, you will find that statue. Now, Sister Mary Grant told me a very interesting thing that I didn't know. Her mother went to school in Roehampton, and there was a room called Our Lady of Aberdeen with the statue in it. Isn't that right, Mary?
The study room, yeah.
Study room, yeah. I wonder if it's still there. And I suppose it was Mother Stewart who brought it. No, it's not there. It probably disappeared during the war.
It was there when I was a student.
Was it?
48.
48, oh, yeah, right. Yes, it really made a deep, deep impression on Mother Stewart. Yeah, right, okay. Yes, she said Father Chisholm took her to Old Aberdeen. That is where the university is. And that crown is a very typically Scottish crown for a church, is of King's College Chapel. One of our sisters, Margaret Pope, has been the acting chaplain of the last year and the assistant chaplain for about 7 years or 8 years. And in the course of that time that she's been there, we've managed to get permission for the students to have evening mass on a Sunday night in the King's College Chapel. Very beautiful chapel. And undoubtedly Father Chisholm would have taken her there. And I'm sure, I don't know what she thought about university education at that time, but anyway, I think she would be happy to know that our sisters have been working in the chaplaincy of that old university, founded by Bishop Elphinstone. That's the interior of it. We had us 500 years not long ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and a very ecumenical occasion, where Anglicans were, Episcopalians were blessing Catholics, and Catholics were blessing Methodists, you know, it was all very, very beautiful. So we've come a long way, a long, long way. That is all that's left of Samuel Rutherford's church in Anwoth. That's all. And he was a Covenanter. I mean, the most extreme type of Presbyterian. He was a Covenanter, and there's one of the gravestones shows that with the memento mori on it, you know. Yeah. And I don't know if you can read that, but it is, it's telling you that Samuel Rutherford, a famous divine, he was a professor at St Andrews University. He wanted to remain as a parish minister of Anwoth, and he was deposed. He had a very bad time with the Episcopalians. He was deposed and he was exiled to a terrible place, Aberdeen. And then he became a professor at St Andrews University, and his books are still available. I've got one on my Kindle. So he was a scholar, but a very unusual man, yes. Minister from 1627 to 1638. So he had an influence on Janet. And that's just another view of the church. Now, I asked people in Anwoth, if a lady came at that time to visit this rural area, where would she have stayed? There weren't any inns or suitable hotels or anything like that. They said, oh, she would have stayed at the big house. So the big house is called Cally House, and today it's Cally Palace Hotel, and it is grand. Has anyone ever been to Cally Palace Hotel? You have, Mary. Isn't it grand?
Very good.
You drive and you pass golf courses and tennis courses. Then you come to the big house. Well, I was a bit in awe, but my friend, a lady of the world, said, not at all, not at all. We'll book in for lunch in the conservatory and ask to be shown over it. So whether Janet lived there or not, I don't know, but I'm sure she walked through the grounds because there's not much to Anworth except the church, the graveyard, and the big house. So it was beautiful. We were there in May, and that's what it was like in the park. It was just like that. It was beautiful. And you see who followed us? So it was a beautiful place. Is there another? Because it's on the Solway Firth. So she would have had the sea, the River Fleet, and the beautiful parklands of the big house. Yeah. So if you like, we'll finish up with the hymn. And I just hope it works because I am not an expert on IT and it came off the internet.